This week we are in the fourth part of a series called Really. That was pretty good. Pretty good for 9:35. Really happy. Now, we're not talking about being very happy. We're talking about being actually happy. We're not talking about instant gratification. We're not talking about pleasure all the time or every day's a Friday. We're talking about a deep-rooted sense of satisfaction and contentment, an unshakable sense that life is good and worth living. I told you about a pastor that I like to listen to who says that if you don't know why something's working when it's working, you won't know how to fix it when it breaks. And the last year has been crazy. Most of us have gone through things that we've never gone through before. Our routines have been changed. There's been this endless amount of uncertainty. And so our happiness equilibrium, at least if I'm speaking for myself, it has kind of been thrown off a little bit. And so we're looking at the things that make us really happy, the way to be really happy. Now, this is it's a several-part series, but it really all comes back to the first message. Everything is really based on the principle that we talked about in the first message. So we're not going to go too much into the other ones, but the thing that you need to know, right, the foundation that we have laid for this, is this whole idea that God is invested in our ultimate sense of well-being. Jesus described him as a father, right? And a good father cares about the happiness, the real happiness, not instant pleasure, constant pleasure, instant gratification, but the real happiness of people. Now, if we're being honest here, from what I know about the area and from what I've read about what the majority of people think in this country, especially in the Northeast, there's this idea that if there is a pursuit of happiness, well then God is in the way of my happiness. There's this belief inside the church and outside the church. Like we've got our happiness box, right? Where it's like all the fun stuff, the dreams, the things we want, the relationships, all the really, and then there's like the God box. And a lot of us treat God like he has no interest in our happiness whatsoever. We said if happiness is a pursuit, like if there's a way to be happiness, well then God is in the way. And for many of us, for me, for a long time, I avoided him. And then other times I would just appease him, or at least I thought, and try and get him out of the way of my happiness. Kind of like the dentist, right? The dentist, you might have a fantastic dentist, but chances are you don't wake up dreaming about going to the dentist, right? And so we either avoid it, which could be problematic, or we appease it. We go to the dentist, get him out of the way, and we get back on the road to our happiness. I told you about this little metaphor that Jesus kind of set up. He was teaching religious people, non-religious people, and the whole idea of this is this concept that he is invested in our well-being. He said he came to give life, and life to the full. What some translations will say, life more abundantly. He's not talking about having a lot of life, right? He's talking about a life that's worth living. Now, just stop for a second. No matter where you are on the faith spectrum, right? Maybe someone forced you to come here today, or threatened you, or promised you lunch, or you really you want this to end, right? Or maybe it's a routine for you. You go to church every single Sunday. What if this is true? What if everything that God says to us is out of his concern for our well-being, our ultimate sense of happiness? What is that true? How would that change the way that we view and understand God? So we're kind of entertaining that idea a little bit. We're looking at things that make us happy. And on the second week, we said, okay, well, happy people are grateful people. Happy people are grateful people. We talked about gratitude and how gratitude is not just saying thanks. It's seeing the good and how essential that is to us being happy, right? And we talked about all the areas where we're told that Thanksgiving, gratitude is a really, really important thing, right? And if it's true that gratitude is essential to our happiness, then anything that undermines our gratitude ultimately undermines our happiness. Then on week 2, or week 3, but the second thing was we talked about peace. We said happy people are peaceful people, full of peace. Not peaceful like they get along with everyone, though that may be true, but full of peace. Life can be crazy, and within them there is this feeling of calm. And if you know people like that, it's attractive, right? Like, we want that. We want that. And so if that's true, we said then anything that undermines your peace ultimately undermines your happiness, your ultimate sense of happiness. And we unpack that a little bit. So that's where we are. That's where we are. But it's this whole idea of what if God is actually invested in our well-being, in our happiness? What if he's better than we thought he was? This week, we are going to look at something that is huge, huge, huge when it comes to following Jesus. And it's also huge when it comes to what we need to be happy. In the 1980s, there were several branches of the military that adopted this thing called the commander's intent. The commander's intent. And basically the idea was that any and every given mission needed to have a mission that can be clearly stated in like 1 or 2 lines. Crystal clear. So there's all these people that are part of this mission. They have all these different roles. There's a lot of complex plans and diagrams and all this stuff going into this mission. But at the end of the day, you need to know if the wheels fall off, if everything falls apart, what are we trying to do? So they might say, okay, the commander's intent for this mission is to get this group safely to that hill. Right? And so there's all these things that go into it. Everybody's got a job, everybody's got a plan. But if the wheels fall off, if things like go crazy, if there's unexpected stuff that comes up, you get up, right? And you look for the hill and you run to it. You run to it. It's the one thing. It's like on a football team. Any given play, the commander's intent of that play is to get your ball into the other team's end zone. And so if you're a lineman, right? And you've never touched a ball before, but somehow the ball ends up in your hands, we're going that way, right? And then you see the lineman run, which is just the best thing in the world. But it's crystal clear. Everyone's got different jobs, but at the end of the day, the mission is the mission. You look to the hill and you run to it. Now, I love that concept because I love simplicity. When things are clear, you can't miss it, right? And so Jesus, when it comes to living this life to the full, which we explained a few weeks ago is like what he says it's like to follow him, he actually gives a commander's intent. There's this scene, it's the last meal he has with his closest followers. They call it the Last Supper. And all these things happen. It's basically like his goodbye speech to them. He breaks bread. If you're familiar with the story, he breaks bread. He says, my body, it's broken for you. He washes their feet. I think, thankfully, he broke the bread actually before he washed their feet. But he gets down, he washes their feet, and it's this expression of how he's going to serve them. He's making all these really, really profound statements, right? And then the mood starts to change, and he says he's gonna leave them. And he gives them the commander's intent. He says, a new command I give you. Not 10 commands, 1. This is the one thing. A new command I give you. He says, love one another. Love one another. If you can sum it all up in one word, the one word is love. Love. It's interesting. There was a Harvard group that did this study. It's been going on since the 1930s. It's still going on. And they followed 268 people and tracked everything they could about them, where they live, what's going on, the good things, the bad things, their diet, their health pattern, like everything they could. They've been tracking them, these same people, since the 1930s, right? I imagine the experiment's coming to an end at some point soon, unless these people are going to live forever. But they're just analyzing everything, and they're trying to figure out what determines if someone's living a life that is satisfying. And in 2009, the guy who was in charge of the experiment at that time, because it's been going on for so long, they've had to switch people who run it, he had an interview with the Atlantic Monthly. And he said, you know what we found? after everything we've learned about this people, it all comes down to one thing. He said, love. Full stop. Comes down to love. In other words, he would say that happy people are people. Happy people are people. Now, if you're an introvert, okay, there's some people who are introverts, meaning they're energized by being alone. Other people who are extroverts, meaning they're energized by being with other people. Like every introvert in the room just like cringed, right? When you saw happy people are people. It's like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. What we're saying is that happy people are people who prioritize relationships. Happy people are people who are concerned, if we're going to define love, like as the concern for the good of another. People who have made habits out of this. This same guy in the article, said 70 years of evidence have shown us that relationships with other people matter, and they matter more than anything else in the world. They found that a lack of social connection can add 30 points to someone's blood pressure reading. In a study of 24,000 employees, they found that those with poor social connections at work were 2 to 3 times more likely to experience anxiety or depression. They found that when women have breast cancer and have to have surgery because of it, the women that join a support group, afterwards, the survival rate increases. It doubles just from joining a support group. They found that a lack of relationships in someone's life can be as detrimental as smoking. It is essential not only to our emotional, our spiritual health, but to our physical health as well. There's one guy who said, one doctor looked at all the research, he said, basically what we're realizing is that if you're on a ship and that ship is sinking, it's just as important that you look for a raft mate as it is that you look for a raft. We need people, and so happy people are people. They are people who prioritize the concern for other people. Now, I told you a few weeks ago, if you were here, I really have an agenda with this series. Like, I want you to see what makes us happy. I want to explore that a little bit. But the other side of the coin is that I want to put on display the fact, or suggest at the very least, that there is a God who 2,000 years ago was saying, if you remember one thing, you just remember people. If you remember one thing, if you forget everything else, if the wheels fall off, there's just one thing, that is the hill that you run to. You remember to be concerned for people. And here we got all this fancy research, all these, university studies, and they're like, you know what? Basically, he said it comes down to one thing, love. One thing. Can you connect those dots? Following Jesus is about people. Living a life that is deeply satisfying is about people. There's a connection there. But Jesus takes us to the next level. Ready? This is where things get kind of freaky. He says, a new command I give to you, love one another as I have loved you. Now this is the new part. He says a new command. The old command was also to love, but he gives them a standard. As I have loved you, he says, so you must love one another. Now he just took the bar that was love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, that's nice, right? He took it and just jacked it up. They had seen him, these people he was speaking to, they had seen him for years care for people nobody cared for. He gave his time to people nobody gave time to. He was nice to people who mistreated him. He was this endless source of patience, this constant source of compassion. They're sitting there. Remember, they're sitting there at the table. Their feet are probably still wet because he has just been on the floor scrubbing their dirty, nasty feet to show them, this is how I'm gonna care for you. And then, he didn't, but he could have said, in a little while, all of you are gonna run away from me. I'm gonna be in trouble and you're gonna abandon me. I'm gonna be doing this for you and you're gonna leave me behind. and I'm gonna be nailed to a cross, and I'm gonna pray for the forgiveness of the people who are nailing me to the cross, as if to say they don't know what they're doing. Like in all of that, the cross, which was a sign of Roman power, the power in the Roman Empire, it was a sign like, don't mess with Rome. He's like, I'm gonna transform that symbol into a symbol of God's love for people. Like he took the bar and he raised it like crazy. And he's saying, this is the commander's intent. I've shown you how to care for people. This is what I want you to do. I want you to care for people who don't deserve it. I want you to be concerned for people nobody else is concerned about. To have compassion on people when they do not deserve your compassion. And so my question for you, for me, the thing that we have to wrestle with is how well do you care for people that don't deserve it? How well do you care for people that tick you off? How well do you love people that you don't like? This is what it's all about. In fact, Jesus addressed this earlier. He said, like, really, what credit is it to you if you love people who love you back? Everybody does that. But what makes his people different is that they love people who don't deserve it. And this is hard. Like, if you're like, okay, that's like really difficult, like I'm right there with you. So a few years ago, I met this guy who flagged me down on the street. I was driving, jumped in front of my car. He needed help. I was like, okay. I was in a rush. I was going to a meeting, and he said he needed help. He needed something. He had this story. The story seemed to make sense. I was in a rush, and so I tried to help him out, and I moved on, right? A few weeks later, this was before we started this church, I was meeting with a consultant from out of town who was going to prepare us, like show us the things we were going to need the things we were going to need to purchase to start this church. And so he's in from out of town. He's just like flown in. We're having an outdoor meeting. And this guy, same guy, comes up and just crashes the meeting. He's got the same exact unique story, right? And he wants help again. And because I have this guy here, I'm just like, okay, fine. And I try and like help him and send him on his way again, right? Well, a third time, a few months later, he shows up. And he's got the same exact story, the same exact unique story. And this time I had time. And so I said, hey, listen, pal, you've given me this story now. This is the third time. What's going on? Right? And as soon as he realized I knew this was a big hoax, he gets in my face and just starts cursing me out. Like at the top of his lungs, dropping F-bombs and all these other bombs and like words I didn't even know. And he's just screaming at me because I knew his story. And I didn't appreciate that, right? But eventually the guy left. So Thursday, like 2 days ago, I leave work. I'm not in the best mood. Like I've got like, you know, the end of the day kind of like blues. And I'm driving home in traffic. I have to stop at a store. I pull into the parking lot and there he is. And I'm like, ooh boy. Like this is not the guy I want to see. And I'm just thinking, I don't want to talk to him. I don't want to look at him. There is no time in my life for right now for his story again. You know, and then I thought like, well, maybe I will have a conversation. Maybe I'll let him know I've heard this story now for the fourth time. And so I get out of the car all like disgruntled, and I just put my head on the ground and like just didn't even look at him. Just totally avoided eye contact. Went inside the store, already in a bad mood, looked at the line. The line was too long, decided it wasn't worth it, so I left. I got back in the car and drove away. The second I sat down, it was like, well, there it is. How well do we love people who don't deserve it? Now, I'm not saying like the right thing to do or the best thing to do would be to give that guy money. But there was no room in my day, in my like emotional space to deal with this person. I have no time for you. Now, if he was nice, if he was somebody who had something to offer me, if I was going to benefit from this, I'm sure I would be like, oh, good to see you. Wow, my friend, right? But no, here's someone who does not deserve my time, and I want nothing to do with him. Now, remember, we're talking about like what Jesus said. We're also talking about life to the full. If Jesus said equals life to the full, well, then what does this mean for my happiness, right? Imagine, what if I saw him? First of all, what if I had let it go last time he cursed me out, right? And then I see him a few days ago. I pull into the parking lot. What if I saw him and just took a minute, a deep breath, and thought about the fact that I might hear the fake story for the fourth time. But what if the real story is worse than the fake story? Like, what kind of situation do you have to be doing that over and over and over again for months? And how humiliating must it be to have some little punk like me be like, I've heard that story 3 times. Like, what if I just stopped and concerned myself for that person? This is what Jesus is talking about. And so how well do we love the people that don't deserve it? Now, if you take this seriously, love as I have loved you, right? It should be overwhelming because Jesus was like the master at loving people. He was very good at it. This would be like, watching Tiger Woods play the front 9 and him walking off and being like, as I played the front 9, you play the back 9. Okay, Tiger. It should be overwhelming. It should be overwhelming. But the idea here, this whole idea is love as I have loved you. This is the how much, but it's also the how to. He is telling these people to express the love that they had experienced. He's telling them to go before people because they know what it's like to have him be for them. They were the ones who were constantly failing. They were the ones who didn't deserve love, and they saw him over and over and over again. And this is why we talk about God's love so often, because it's not something we can just muster up. It's not something we just be like, all right, let me try my best to love just like Jesus did. It has to be something that comes out of us. Like a few years ago, or last year, it seems like 10 years ago, we talked about love and how love is hard to initiate, but it is easy to reciprocate. And so we're just not reciprocating to the source that it came from. The idea is that if we take a minute and just understand what it's like to be accepted in spite of our flaws, in spite of our doubts, in spite of our past, our issues, the things we believe, the things we don't believe, we just understand we are fully and completely embraced, it is easier to turn to people who don't deserve it and pass that on to them. Love as I have loved you. Express the love that you have experienced. He raises the bar and tells us how to meet it. That's a big thing. It's a big thing. We cannot love like Jesus unless we know what it feels like to be loved by Jesus. And so, if all of this is true, if happy people are people, then anything that undermines your relationships ultimately undermines your happiness. Is there a relationship right now in your life that is undermining your happiness? Now, a little disclaimer, there are some toxic relationships. There are some dangerous relationships, some relationships that you need to create space from. In fact, Jesus actually spoke about that. He said, there's a time to wipe the dust off your feet and say, move on. But for most of us, most of the time, it's not like that. It's people who annoy us, right? And so I think the thing that undermines our relationships is our right, our rights. When I am in the right, and so I have the right. I have been wronged. I am right. And so, till you get yourself together, come back and own up to what you did, there's no peace between us. And if we're honest, that unresolved issue is undermining your happiness. In fact, if you've ever had an unresolved issue and you put your foot in the ground and said, no, I'm not gonna fix it, but you went back and fixed it, you feel better when you did. When we are right, when we feel right, in the right, have the right to feel this way because they did this, that undermines our relationships. Happy people are people who are willing to make things right even when they've been wronged. So is there a relationship where you are right, where you feel right because you've been wronged? You have the power to fix that. You have the ability to fix that. The other thing, and this could get a little hairy, when it comes to being right, have the right, in the right, but also our belief about what is right. What a lot of people would call our religion. What we believe to be right can undermine our relationships, our ability to love people. I can't go into each example, but in the most emphatic passages about love, the potential barrier to love almost every single time is someone's religion. If you know the story of the Good Samaritan, it's about like a guy who gets beat up and he's left for dead on the side of the road. Who walks by him? A priest. Who's the other guy that walks by him? A Levite, which was another person in religious authority. And then the Samaritan comes over and does the right thing and takes care of the guy. The Samaritan, to the ancient Jewish people, they were detestable. They hated them. They were the people who believed the wrong thing and did the wrong thing. They looked down on them. And so for Jesus to say, like, this is what it looks like to love your neighbor, and for him to bring up a religious example was like, are you kidding me? The Apostle Paul, we've talked about him. He wrote a lot of letters in the New Testament. When he talks about love, like the famous love passage, love is patient, love is kind, right? That whole thing. You've probably heard it at a wedding. Right before that, he gives a bunch of examples as if to say, if you do these things but you don't love, it's nothing. And what does he give? He gives all religious examples. If I can prophesy, if I have faith that can move mountains, if I give all I have to the poor, he says, if I could speak in the tongues of men and of angels, all these religious practices, he says, if I do that, but I don't love, I have nothing. I have nothing. There's another letter that he writes to a church in a city called Galatia. They're fighting over circumcision, which was a religious thing to the Jewish people. Some of the people, probably like the adult uncircumcised males, were like, no, we don't want to do that. And then the people who were already circumcised were like, no, you have to. That's part of this whole thing. And the Apostle Paul steps in and he says, no, the only thing that matters is your faith. The only thing that matters is your faith expressing itself through love. And so in every one of these examples, I know they seem like kind of random, but it's all like, watch out for the deceptive nature of religion, of what you believe to be right. In other words, Jesus might say that if your belief about what is right causes you to treat people wrongly, then you're not in the right. The church has a history of prioritizing being right about issues over treating people the right way. The only people, when Jesus showed up, if you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first 4 books in the New Testament, the only people, for the most part, that Jesus has an issue with are the religious teachers who know all the right things, do all the right things, keep all the right rules, and they don't care about people, and they just can't see that because they're blinded by the deceptive nature of what I believe to be right. Right now, so this has happened for the last 2,000 years. It happened before that, and it's continuing to happen now. You don't have to go very far. You can go on social media and look at Christians, well-intentioned Christians, who feel the need to broadcast in not so loving ways what they believe to be right. Like we pick a side, we draw a line, and we decide the people on the other side are the villains. And there's no negotiating, there's no talking with a villain because they're evil. They have evil agendas. And so the church historically has continued to steamroll people because of what we believe to be right. A good example of this right now is the fact that June is Pride Month. You're going to see a lot of rainbow flags celebrating the LGBTQ community. And I'm not talking about whether this is right or wrong. That's not the point at all. My point is, have you stopped to think about what it's like? I think there really aren't many groups in our country who have experienced more shame than that group. And a lot of it has come at the hands of the church. Have you stopped to think about the person behind the issue, in spite of what you think? Where you personally fall on this issue is totally, totally irrelevant. I can tell you people who do care about the people in that community, people who have loved ones who are members of the LGBTQ community. You know why? It's not necessarily because of a view that they have, whether they're on one side or the other. It's because they have come to understand it as something that's about people, not something that's about an issue. It's not about being right, it's about treating people right. So it totally changes the way that they view the issue. It's just one example. Have you thought about what it's like to be a member of law enforcement right now? Have you stopped just to think about it? There have been some horrible things that have happened in our country over the last year and before that. But have you stopped to think about what it's like to wake up in the morning to go and serve people, to like put yourself in danger over and over again, and just to be seen as a villain because of the uniform that you wear? Have you stopped and thought about it? Have you stopped to think about what it's like to be a racial minority in our country? To have people come to conclusions about you before you do or say anything? Have you thought about that? But we are, especially in the church, we are so concerned about being on the right side. Well, I support this, but I don't support this. I support this idea, but I don't support that organization. And here's the line, and I want to make sure I'm on the right side of it. And we get so concerned about that. But have you stopped to just think about the people behind the issues? This is the commander's intent. This is what we were told to do. Doesn't mean we don't have beliefs. Doesn't mean we don't have views, but we prioritize taking care of people. In fact, Jesus, like even right now, people argue about what Jesus, like what his views were on certain things, because sometimes it was unclear. He was so concerned about the person behind the view that even now, like theologians are like, well, we're not totally sure how he felt about that because he didn't seem to address it. He only cared about the person. We need to learn to do this, to start prioritizing being concerned for people over being concerned about being on the right side. But when we do, it's unbelievable. And this is how Jesus closes this section. And it gives me the goosebumps, really. He says, by this, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. This will be the defining character. This will be how people recognize you. I don't need to tell you that's not the case in most of the world right now. But in some places it is. And where it is unbelievable. In fact, the first church, historians, they don't understand how the church made it past the first 300 years. They had no power. They had no influence. They had people who were out to get them. And yet they grew by the thousands. And it was because all they had was this. They didn't have a Bible. Their lives were the proof. They leveraged love for one another, and so people were drawn to it. And it grew by the thousands. Like corruption started to enter the church in big ways once the church got power. And then they no longer needed to leverage love. What if we did that? Could you imagine like what we could do? Jesus started this with way less people that are in this room. Way less people then are in this room. Could you imagine, like here, we're a new church. What if we decided we were going, doesn't mean we don't have beliefs, doesn't mean we don't stand for anything, but we were going to constantly do the hard work of prioritizing people, to be for people above everything else. That's why we say our vision as a church, we want to be a church that is for people who don't go to church. Not just that we do things that people who don't go to church will like, but we are for them. We are in their corner, and we do it because Jesus is for us. We're expressing what we have experienced. Could you imagine if we did that? Right now, people are looking. They are looking for something to fight for. Have you noticed? Like people are looking for a side to land on. And I believe we've been wired to do that. I think we were wired to have a cause, to have a purpose, to have something to pour ourselves into. Jesus has invited us to be in the fight for people, to be the voice of unity in division, to be the voice of love in hate, to be for people who are against one another. And it's sloppy, it's messy, it gets hairy. When you're working with people who don't always believe exactly what you believe or fall on some other political side of the spectrum, it can be hard. But when we make mistakes, when it's not clear where we should go, when we feel like we've lost our way, When we don't know exactly what to do, we look to the hill and we run to it. We remember the commander's intent to express the love that we've experienced ourselves. And hopefully, by that, everyone will know that we are his followers. Let's pray together. God, we are grateful that you love us. Grateful that we don't have to muster up love ourselves, but that we could simply pass on the love that's been given to us. God, would you do great things through your followers here in this community? Would you teach us how to prioritize people over issues? Would you give us moments of clarity when we stop and think, what's it like to be on the other side of me? Would you teach us how to care like you did? Teach us how to live like you did. And God, we pray that people would know us here in Babylon as your followers because of the way that we love one another. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.